creepy forest rapist. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored, and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area, nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea, since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign "Park closes at 10", and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down. So I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods, a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on, and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer, though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods, and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in the bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this: a man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come, and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree, and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve, where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman, alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones. And even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around, but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circled back and seen my parked car alone in the lot, if he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind, and he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. Creepy guy in the shack. I've lived most of my life way out in the valley countryside of Ontario. Given that's not a whole lot for an 18-year-old, but for me it's the only place I can call home, and I like to think that I know the entire area, as far and sprawling as it is, like the back of my hand. Adventures across the long, crisscrossing roads, pastures and woods that made up the skeleton of my village were a common venture in my childhood. As a young kid, I had a habit of biking extremely far out in hopes of finding new places, and sometimes my dad or one of my friends' parents would toss our bikes in their pickup and take us way out onto a back road and let us explore for a few hours. This was how a lot of us first found that on one of these creepy gravel roads, surrounded by thin woods, was a worn-down old shack sitting just about 20 meters off of the path. Honestly, I never thought anything of it, except for the fact that it was creepy. It had no windows to see inside, and I never went anywhere near it, but one of my friends at the time said that her older sister had tried to go in it, and that the door was always locked. We all had better things to be curious about at the time than that anyway, so I quickly moved on, and it became nothing more than a mundane landmark of that area. Honestly, I had completely forgotten about it for a few years now. Except last Tuesday, I was coming home from one of my very late classes at my university, and I usually take the back roads I perused many years ago, as they're more straightforward and scarcely ever have any sort of traffic. As I drove down the gravel path that would wind along the side of the country and eventually take me to the next street I needed to turn onto, I noticed a faint glinting coming from within the trees up ahead, maybe about 100 meters from my car. A flashlight? I thought. But as my car came closer, I realized what I was really seeing. The light inside of the shack was on. I should mention now that in all of the nearly 13 years I've spent living in my area, I've never seen the door open, and I've never seen a light on inside of that shack. Ever. Not even once. I must have driven past that shack probably almost 100 times in my life. But this was the first time I'd ever seen any sign of a person's presence having been anywhere near that thing. That, coupled with the fact that it was 10 o'clock at night and pitch black outside, aside from my own headlights, and the faint incandescent glow lighting up the doorframe up ahead, immediately filled me with what I can only describe as a weird sense of dread. It would be hard for most people not to be immediately unsettled by something like that, and I am someone who's easily spooked. Fortunately, while my car approached the light, I was curious enough that, despite the feeling in my stomach, I slowed down as I was about to pass, hoping that I could see what was going on inside. And this is probably the only reason I managed to spot the dark shape that burst out of the foliage on the side of the road, directly into my path. I wasn't going very fast at that point, but I still pounded the brakes rather hard in alarm, so my car came to a crunching stop on the gravel. For a moment, I was just really confused and freaked out. What was that? Had I almost hit a deer or something? This far out in the country, a deer would have been the most likely and most reasonable assumption. But in the beams of my car, I could see what had stopped me. A very tall, very lanky old man, with scraggly and balding gray hair. Right away I got the impression that this man was very poor. He looked dirty and unkempt, and his clothes hung off of him. However, I'm generally used to seeing people who aren't that well off in my town, and I don't like to judge people right away based off of that sort of thing. So I was mostly just extremely unsettled over what the hell this guy was doing way out here, and why he had walked out in front of my car. As I sat there confused, the old man came around to my window and knocked on the glass. Feeling my memories of stranger danger conversations with my parents kicking in, as old as those conversations were, I rolled down the window just a crack, only enough for someone to be able to hear me, and for me to hear them. I was already creeped out enough as it was. Immediately, I had to say what I was thinking. What are you doing out here?" I asked. In my peripheral vision, I could still see the light from the shack, but in my mind's eye, I wasn't really registering it anymore. Stupid, I know. I should have made the connection immediately, but I was still kind of shaken by the fact that I could have run this guy over if I hadn't been able to stop in time. And being a new driver and all, the thought of that was terrifying. After a small pause, the man started talking to me. He had a thick, croaky sort of voice, and he spoke very slowly. "My truck, it's broken," he explained. Okay. I was also getting the feeling that he wasn't really all there mentally. I didn't have to look around to notice there wasn't any truck on the side of the road, but I did anyway, turning my head around to confirm what I already knew. There was definitely no truck. Had he somehow driven it into the trees or something? As far as I could remember and see, there wasn't enough space anywhere in them for a truck to fit through. What was the man talking about? While I was looking, It was honestly as though I could feel that he was watching me, and when I turned back, he was still leaning down to peer inside of my window at me. "Where? I don't see it," I blurted. I was definitely distrustful of this guy already. At first, he didn't respond, and my nerves were only getting worse the longer we were alone out here. Then he replied, "It's just up the road," he said, turning just to point with his finger in that general direction. The lights on my car aren't exactly the greatest, but I could still see far enough that I really couldn't imagine where on earth this truck was supposed to be. I couldn't spot the faintest sight of it. While I squinted up ahead, he continued, "I'll show you where, if you come." At this point, I really had no idea what this old man was thinking I could do to help. I'm 18 years old, female and very petite. I don't exactly look like the type of person who knows a lot about cars or how to fix them. And for the record, I'm really not. But I was tired from a long day at school, so I absolutely was not at my brightest. And for some reason, a part of me felt guilty about leaving him out here, alone, if his truck really was broken. "Okay," I said, and I reached to my gear shift to start driving slowly up the road. But as soon as he saw my hand, he shook his head. "Just walk. It's not too far." What? Excuse me, but no thanks. How the hell was I going to see anything in the dark if I got out of my car and followed him anyway? There was no harm in driving wherever he was trying to lead me. The more I talked to the guy, the more unnerved I was getting, and the more red flags were starting to pop up in my mind. I couldn't see a car anywhere, and this total stranger wanted me to get out of mine and follow him into the dark on this creepy road in the middle of nowhere. I will admit I am a bit of a naive person, but I'm definitely not that stupidly so. No, I'd rather drive to it," I responded. This situation really wasn't making any sense to me. I could see his brow furrow, and he looked kind of agitated. He insisted, "Your car won't fit in the trees anyway." So did his truck crash then? Why the trees if we were going up the road? I remembered what I'd just been thinking a minute earlier, about there not being enough space, and I asked him, "Then how did yours get in the trees?" The only logical explanation would have been that his truck had swerved off the road, but even if that were the case, there was seriously nothing at all that I could have done to help him fix his car, or get it back out again. It genuinely made no sense at all to be asking me to come with him and help, and the entire situation was beginning to make me very scared. There was a lengthy enough pause between my question and him speaking up that I was beginning to think he didn't hear me or something. So I asked again, still no immediate answer. When he finally did reply, he was staring at me directly in the eyes. I think I am going to have nightmares about it for a long time. It was so sudden, and the way he said it was just so unbelievably creepy. "You don't look old enough to drive." I hear comments like this a lot, since I do look very young because of my size. Normally, somebody would say this with a smile or something, to signify that this is, in fact, meant to be taken as a joke. But the guy's face didn't change even slightly. He just kept staring at me with a completely cold expression. The sheer inappropriateness of such a remark in that kind of situation immediately had my heart racing, and all I could think, what did this guy want with me? What I wanted to say next was, "Who are you?" But instead I anxiously fumbled for my phone in my pocket, babbling in a way that probably made it really obvious I was completely freaked out of my mind. Okay. I can just call someone to come help you out. There's not really anything I can do." As I said that, it occurred to me to wonder, did this old guy not have a cell phone of his own? I know not every older person has one, even if they're becoming much more common, but seriously. And then I also remembered, with a sudden streak of massive fear, the shack with the light on. I could still see the light coming from it, just up ahead in the trees, and my dumb brain finally put two and two together. The old man hadn't even mentioned it at all. It was like it wasn't even there to him, and there was definitely no one out there that could have turned the light on but the guy who was standing outside my car right now. What was he doing out here in that shack then, which had been locked for all these years by someone I never knew? There was definitely no truck around here. He wanted me out of my car for another reason. I think maybe the old man must have seen on my face that I was scared out of my wits and about to book it out of there. Instead of any words, without warning, his face contorted with rage, and he swung his fist, pounding it against my window with enough strength to make it shudder. His eyes were wide, and he looked furious and completely insane. Even though I was panicking more than I ever had in my life, and I was sure he was about to smash the window in if he tried again, I screamed, threw my phone onto the floor, switched gears, and slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I hurtled down the road, and when I glanced into my rear-view mirror, I saw his dark shape turn from standing in the road, and I watched as he turned, and he walked off the road, directly back towards the light of the shack. I didn't slow down at all until I was nearly home, and absolutely sure that there was no way that he could have followed me. When I got home that night, I spent a long time crying about what had happened with my mom. And though I don't think she believed all of what I told her, we don't have the greatest relationship. She called up everyone she knew to ask if anyone knew the old man, or if they knew who owned that shack. In a town like ours, just about everyone knows each other, but no one had any clue who he was. One of our family friends even swore that he was sure it's been abandoned for at least 4 years now. And since most people don't usually take that road, no one said that they've ever seen a light on or the door open but me. I've been taking a different route home from school since, and I really don't think I ever want to head back down that road. Don't meet my mom again. My mom grew up in South Florida, and this started during the early 70s. She was a senior in high school, and she met a guy at a wedding. He was the drummer in the wedding band, a few years older than her, and therefore he was the cool, mysterious guy that many girls her age dreamed of. They immediately hit it off, and he commented on her saddle shoes she was wearing at the time. She gave him her phone number, and I believe they maybe went on 1 or 2 dates, and everything seemed totally fine. He would regularly call the house, and she would sit on the kitchen floor and talk to him. One night, their phone conversation took a weird turn. He started asking her things like, "Have you ever thought about killing yourself?" And, "Do you ever think about murdering people?" Obviously, she was shocked at this and got very uncomfortable and completely stopped talking to him. This is the last she heard from him, or so she thought. It was 2012, and I had just graduated from college. I was hanging out in my college town to finish out my lease and work and figure out my next move. My mom calls me and says something weird has been going on. She tells me she's received a letter from this man she knew in high school. I had no idea about this guy, as she had never mentioned him at all to me, my siblings, or my dad. She explains to me who this man is and how she knew him, but hadn't spoken to him since that one uncomfortable phone call. The letter said something like, "I see you're really happy and married with kids, etc." But he goes on to mention each of us by name. He also mentions my dad's name and where he works. My parents met in college in another state. They quickly married, graduated college, and moved to yet another state. And then another state once my two sisters were born. She had no idea how he knew her new married name and address. She has never been on social media, and once she had all of us kids, had stopped working. If you were to Google her name, you wouldn't find a thing. She then recalls getting a phone call from the Alumni Association at her college, telling her that a man had been calling on and off for months, trying to get her contact information, but they weren't allowed to give out that information. She then tells me his name, and I remember having a Facebook friend request and a Twitter follow request from this man. My siblings all had them as well. My mom, having no social media, like I mentioned, asked me to see if I could dig around his social media accounts and see what I could find. I find a Music MySpace and a Reverb Nation page of some really terrible music he had recorded and uploaded. One of the songs was called Victoria, which is her name. All of the other songs had seemingly normal titles like Summer's Day, etc. I tell my mom this, and she freaks out. I send her the link, and it's hard to make out the lyrics because the quality is so bad. But he mentions her saddle shoes, her beauty, etc. They literally hung out twice, 40 years ago, and these were songs that had been recorded pretty recently. I dig a little deeper and find out that he's made a website dedicated to freeing Amanda Knox, the woman accused of murdering her roommate in Italy. This was super alarming at the time, but I've since not put too much weight on that, since her innocence is actually very possible, but it's still very strange. My dad didn't seem fazed by any of this, but my mom was freaked out and wouldn't stay home alone since this man knows their address. She ends up telling all of this to a family friend who is a private investigator, and he decides to do some digging on this guy. First of all, he's changed his last name. Secondly, he's moved to about 5 different states in the last 20 years under different aliases and working completely different jobs. There wasn't much that could be done since he never actually threatened my mom, and he somehow didn't have a record. He still pops up every now and then with friend requests to my siblings and me, but other than that, no one knows what his deal is. The fact that he's moved around quite a lot and changed his name is definitely a red flag. I personally think this dude is a serial killer, and if he's not, then he's just a sad, lonely, mentally unstable man, and I hope he gets the help he needs. But stalker musician man / possible serial killer, props if you stuck through this whole thing. I know it's not as creepy as most of the other stories on this sub, but I'm lucky enough that this is all I've got. Mom meets a psychotic man in the 70s, he resurfaces in 2012 to let her know he knows exactly where she lives and everything about her, and has written creepy music about her. Here, Piggy Piggy. This happened way back in 1980. I was 5 years old, and I was invited to a neighbor's birthday party. We lived in the quiet suburbs of Baltimore, Maryland. It was an idyllic town. Trees lined the streets, looking over the neighborhood like giant looming sentinels. It was early October. I remember this because the houses were decorated for Halloween. The boys' parents pulled out all the stops to make their son's party one to remember. There was a slow-moving, sad-faced donkey that the smaller children were permitted to ride. I was not allowed to ride the donkey. I was a fat boy, even at age 5. I was also as loud as I was fat. It was my loud mouth that caused this pleasant afternoon of cake, ice cream, and piñatas to quickly unravel into a horrifying nightmare. Aside from the usual accoutrements at a 7-year-old's party, there was a clown. The clown walked around silently, prancing and smiling. He would laugh silently. He would do the old "I got your nose" trick and pull coins out from behind our ears. He made balloon animals and attempted to ride a unicycle. The other kids laughed. I hated the clown. Everything about him made me uncomfortable. And because of this, my fat 5-year-old self decided it was a decent idea to give the clown a hard time. Birthday Boy announced aloud that it was time to head inside to see the special clown magic show. All the kids went into the living room and sat on the hardwood floor. I stood in the back. The clown proceeded with the magic show. He pulled a fake rabbit out of his hat and performed other hack tricks as I stood in the back of the room and jeered him. I would yell out how the tricks were done. The clown continued to silently smile, making no sound as he went about his magical presentation. His face said happiness, but his eyes screamed in rage at me. This went on for 15 minutes. The kids laughed as the clown fumbled through some crappy dime store magic tricks. I do not know if it was an act of mercy, but Birthday Boy's parents shouted, "Piñata time," and all the kids ran outside to smash a cardboard donkey stuffed with candy. After a few minutes outside, all of the fruit punch I drank throughout the day wanted out. I scurried back into the house in search of the toilet. The house was quiet, and the sun had shifted in the sky, leaving the kitchen and the adjoining hallway bathed in a murky early evening light. As I walked through the kitchen and into the hall, from a room in the hall stepped the clown into the hallway. He stood there staring at me, staring at him. It seemed like one of those Wild West showdowns from the cowboy movies my dad used to watch on television. He lurched slowly toward me, his painted smile unwavering, but his eyes bloodshot and filled with unbridled hatred. I walked a few steps in reverse before spinning on my heels and trying to make it to the kitchen. I felt a large hand land on my shoulder. I was spun around forcefully and fell to the floor. The clown stood above me for a moment, before putting a giant clown shoe on my fat chest. I remember trying to squirm, and I remember wanting to scream and cry for help, but it never happened. He stood over me, pinning me to the floor, before brandishing one of those old-style seltzer bottles. He proceeded to spray the crotch of my pants, and in a sing-song voice, he cooed, "Piggy goin' pee-pee, piggy goin' pee-pee," until the contents of the bottle were drained. When he removed his foot from my chest, I lashed out with my feet, kicking at his shins and trying to scurry away at the same time. I ran into a pantry and slammed the door. It was really a terrible hiding place. He had to see where I went. The pantry was about 4 feet away from where I was laying on the floor just moments ago. It was dark in the pantry and smelled of Pine Sol cleaning solvent. There was no lock on the inside to protect me from the clown. In the dark pantry, I slid to the floor and tried not to sob uncontrollably. Minutes passed. Those minutes felt like hours. I heard no sound other than my wheezing, and a fear fart that squeaked out. "Oh, Piggy, Piggy, did you make poopy in the pantry?" The voice came from inside the dark pantry in which I was hiding, or so I thought. I froze in fear, not moving, not breathing. I did not know where the clown was. If he was in the pantry with me, I needed to get out. If he was out there, I needed to stay in the pantry. I lowered my head to the floor and squinted through the gap between the bottom of the pantry door and the floor. There was not much to see. What little light bled through the bottom of the door was quickly blacked out, and a bloodshot eye stared back at me from the other side of the door. There was a low, guttural laugh, and a voice that either hissed, "Boo, Piggy," or "Pooh, Piggy." I squeezed my eyes shut and started crying at a near hysterical level. The door swung open, and I screamed as loud as I could. Standing in the doorway was my dad. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked. "Clown!" I screamed. He carried me out of the pantry and out of the house, and back to the safety of our house. I'll never forget what I saw in those boxes. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically, what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks, where you'd do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. I was told it covered roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland, USA, about 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was about 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it was the middle of nowhere. I was working at the farm clearing bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy called Jeremy, who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot and the work was hard. So one day, when the temperature hit about 38 degrees Celsius, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a water hole on the farm, about a 25-minute drive north. I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the Arvo, so him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses, with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. "Do you see that over there, beneath the 2 dead trees?" I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer, we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed. I asked him if he knew what it was, but obviously he didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when he drove through the same area about 5 weeks before, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood, given it was his property. But in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated, so they buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, "With all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go." He brushed me off, however, reminding me it was his farm, and whoever had put this here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air-conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see this was some sort of IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered, office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered to the middle and sat down at the desks to see if the computers could give us any idea of what the hell was going on here. My heart was racing, and I just wanted to bolt. We had been seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other hand, was adamant we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was endless lists of computer talk. It was like the old Napster or LimeWire download screens looked like, just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container, to the big pile of storage boxes. By then I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided, against my better judgment, to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief sift through this box still makes me feel sick to the stomach. It didn't take long for me to realize that this box was full of posters, DVDs, and photos, all of hardcore child pornography. One thing that still gets to me is that it was all neatly ordered into folders and smaller boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up, and ran over to Jeremy. I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception, and we hadn't bought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about a half hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, very remote. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 four-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. This is where it gets worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open and there was fire inside. We had only 2 small extinguishers in the cars, and these did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran it knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was huge, so there was no real way to tail them. Since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first instance, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was also impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who might be responsible, the investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still sitting there on the farm, as it's too expensive to move. The craziest thing I've ever heard. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living in my parents' house. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail, only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night, as I always did, following bare precautions. I hung the leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, and so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than the food. Several days passed and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much more likely an animal than a person. Then I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees, 100 miles from the nearest city plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out, claiming to have a gun, but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash at whatever opened it. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lied frozen, awake in my tent, until sunrise, and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence something had actually happened were the boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed, and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail, being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line. I could see the trail winding for miles in front of and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said out loud, "This trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located off I-5. The only problem was that it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got in my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sound. I knew they were close, but wasn't sure how close. Finally, a flashlight hits my tent, lights up the entire thing, and goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in movies, where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them, and the camera pans around the trees because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent, and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance. I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Castella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta, and spoke with the police and Forest Service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and Forest Service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of the couple. The Monstrous Hotel. My next-door neighbor's parents moved from India to the UK back in the 60s. After retiring, they made a habit of heading back there every year to visit family and friends, ultimately spending around half their time traveling through India and half their time here. Long story short, one year they invite my family along. Now, my neighbor's dad has planned this holiday like it's a military campaign. When we arrive, he hands each of us, including my 11-year-old brother and sister, a brown folder containing our itinerary, hotel brochures, money conversion charts, train timetables, 4 passport photos of ourselves for forms, etc., and a list of names under the header Useful People. Forget Viking rock prints. Other than the fact that I'm mistaken for a girl on several occasions. My favorite being when one of my neighbor's relatives asks my mum why she lets me dress like a boy and offers to have a sari fitted for me. I have an amazing time. Until we rock up to this huge hotel in the middle of the jungle. Honestly, the arse end of nowhere. The nearest village is a 3-hour drive down a dirt road. Just before sunset, I pull out the brochure. It'd be safe to say that this place is under new management. There's a single light on about 5 stories up. As we pull into the drive, we spot a group of men clustered around a large fire. One of them stands and starts shouting something, but is silenced by the guy next to him with a slap to the back of his head. One of the group comes sauntering over and motions our driver to wind down the window. Imagine Alfred Hitchcock as an Indian drug lord, and you'll have a pretty good idea of the man now flapping his jowls through our window. In broken English, he welcomes us to the hotel, glances over our reservations, and ushers us into the lobby. The place is deserted. Not the staff have gone to bed deserted. There were toppled chairs in the lobby. Hitchcock tells us that our rooms aren't ready. It is now 9 p.m. and offers us some food while we wait. The dining room is huge, empty, and our order is taken by a boy no older than 9 who promptly vanishes, closing the doors behind him. We hear a motorbike engine outside, and an hour later, something vaguely resembling our order appears on a variety of mismatched dinnerware. No idea where any of it came from. At this point, we were all pretty unnerved, and everyone started making lame jokes to ease the tension. We were only there for one night. Everything had been paid for in advance, and we were a large group, 11 in total, with 2 people who spoke Hindi and Konkani, so felt pretty sure we could deal with any weirdness. Hitchcock waddles in and takes us to our rooms. Every one of them is stripped bare, apart from the beds and bedside tables. Exposed wires poke out of the walls where you'd expect a TV and/or a phone, and there are rectangular patches of discolored wallpaper, suggesting that someone finally took a stand against terrible hotel artwork. The only decoration is this creepy little metal horse that's just sitting on one of the bedside tables. I'm sharing with my little bro and insist on taking the bed closest to the door, presumably thinking that I could summon Thor if things got hairy. Hitchcock lingers in our doorway for a while, flashing his pearly browns and giving me the rape eyes. I close the door on him. We dump our bags, check the door is locked, and have bro chats until we pass out. I wake up, no clue when. Clocks clearly didn't fit with the whole minimalist crack-den vibe the management were going for, but it's pitch black. To hear the door to my room clicking shut. The door that is no further than a foot from my head. I'm no Viking rock prince. I'm a flying baby that plays a harp. I cower under the surprisingly clean blankets until my heart stops threatening to burst out of my ribs and redecorate the ceiling. Stealthy Ninja rolls out of my bed and to the door. Check little bro is alive, get into bed, see our bags, add them to the barricade. Notice that mine is open. Plot twist. Nothing's missing. Camera, wallet, clothes, super secret spy dossier, everything is intact. I convince myself that I shat my pants over nothing and go back to sleep. Side note, little bro slept through the whole thing. Morning comes, and we all want to get out of there as soon as possible. Neighbor's dad kicks off about how weird the whole thing is to Hitchcock, and gets half of our money back. Excellent. We head outside, and my sister points out the charred remains of one of the hotel beds in what's left of the fire pit. Excellent. Turns out that our driver, who had a room in the place, had decided to sleep in the bus because he, his own words, didn't want their funny business. Apparently, there were people coming and going all night. He woke up to see a guy, nose against the window, just staring in at him. Driver hit the window, and the dude scampered off into the jungle. We give driver an extra huge tip. Hitchcock waves at us from the lobby, adjusts his crotch, and plods back in. We leave, thinking the weirdness is over. Shyamalan. About an hour into the journey, I decide to take a look at our itinerary, so pull out my spy folder. My heart instantly sinks. One of my passport photos is gone. A perfect 35 by 45 millimeter rectangle missing from the corner. 3 little Viking rock cherubs stare up at me, mourning their fallen brother. Everything from the night before rushes back. I explain what happened, and there's this weird moment of silence where everyone looks at each other. Turns out that everybody heard someone outside or at their door at some point during the night, but had deadbolted them before going to sleep. Bro and I had no deadbolt. Driver suggests that we head back to the hotel and demand satisfaction. Tips galore for driver. We arrive at hotel. The doors are padlocked. Hitchcock and his cronies have vanished. The little metal horse that was sat on our bedside table has been placed on the step in front of the doors. I took it. Free souvenir.